Hi everybody, it's Laura. Thank you so much for joining me on my channel. Today I have a layout that I made for a Punched Out Thursday to Die For. In a Punched Out Thursday to Die For, we use our punches and our dies and we create a scrapbooking layout. So this layout has a very long history. I started making this layout the last time I went to a crop, which was quite a while ago. I think it was in August. And I ended up making the mixed media background that you see here, only a small part of it actually. And then I put the layout aside and I kind of forgot about it. So I'm starting out here with a piece of gessoed thick white cardstock. And then I used a shimmer spray on it. I used a spritz called Walkin'a Tight Heliotrope. And I'm also using some bubble wrap. I usually just use a regular piece of plastic, but every once in a while I like to use some bubble wrap because I like the texture that it gives to the background. Now this video turned out to be one of my longest videos just because I kept trying different techniques on the background, but I started off with intentions of just making a very simple mixed media background, and I had a number of items that I was thinking I could use on this layout. You can see to the left of my mat, I have a number of strips of paper from a really old little yellow bicycle collection. It's a Halloween collection that I really like, but for some reason, it just didn't motivate me. It wasn't inspiring me. So that's what ended up happening. I made this background and planned on completing the layout, and I just found that this particular collection didn't go with what I had in mind. So I'm following my usual procedure for a mixed media background. I spread the color around in different shapes. For this layout, I decided that I was going to have a small cluster in the upper right-hand corner and then a large cluster covering the majority of the background. And then after I added the color, I dried the background, added some more color so that it would be a little bit more intense, so the color would be a little bit darker or more intense. And then after I dried that, I added some splatters. I love to add lots of splatters to my background. So you could see that I add a couple of rounds of splatters to both the small cluster and the large one. I'm actually really glad that I held off on finishing this layout because I've recently really fallen in love with a 49 and Market collection. It's called Curiosities in Willow Grove. And it's interesting because one of the schools in my district is called Willow Grove, so it's easy for me to remember that. But I just really love Halloween, and I'm also a big fan of 49 and Market. You may know that from watching my channel. And so I was really excited this year when Vicki Boutin designed a collection for 49 and Market, and I have been using that collection quite a bit, and that's the collection that I end up using for this layout. So this is the photo that I'm going to use. It's a picture of my daughter Julia on Halloween. So I have it already matted on some white cardstock, and then I matted again on some black cardstock. And I also added a few splatters of watered down black acrylic paint to the background. So now it's several months later and I'm looking at this background with fresh eyes. I decided to add some modeling paste to the background. I have my Crafters Workshop modeling paste and a Tim Holtz stencil that I really love. And I love the way for Halloween you can go with more traditional things like bats and spiders, but you can also go with a more gothic theme. So that's what I was thinking of for this background. So I added the modeling paste and I decided to spray on top of it. And I really liked that look, but you'll see that as I go through this layout, I keep struggling with how much I want the background to be purple and how much I wanted to have like some white accents. And so that does end up being resolved, but I go back and forth a little bit. So I also thought that I would add a little bit of black to the background just to break up that purple, and I think that black's a good complement to the purple since it's a Halloween background. And to add the black, I used some distress ink and I squished it onto a piece of plastic and then added some water to it, and that added some color that I was able to kind of mush around the background. And you can see that the background's getting a little bit messy, but I'm not really worried about that. It doesn't bother me, especially on Halloween layouts. Some other layouts, I might go back in and clean it up a little bit, but for this layout, I was perfectly happy to have a lot of splatter and a lot of stray color kind of all over the place. So after I dried the background, I decided that I would go in with a little bit more purple. And like I said, I keep going back and forth. I was afraid that I might have covered up too much of the modeling paste. So I do end up adding some more modeling paste a little bit later. But right now I'm adding some white splatters, which I always think makes everything better. And now I've changed locations in the house, so if my voice sounds a little bit different, that's why. For the white splatters, I like to use watered down white acrylic paint. And then here I am adding some watered down black acrylic paint for the black splatters. And then this is one of the kind of conundrums I always fall into. I'm thinking, should I have left it the way it was earlier? Did I go too far with adding too much color? So I was considering that as I was adding some of the splatters, and then I decided that I was going to go back in and match the stencil up with the stenciling that's on the background and add a little bit more modeling paste. Now in the beginning, my goal was to just go over some of the modeling paste, but then I liked the way it looked as I went along, so I decided that I was going to not go over every little bit of the modeling paste, but the majority of it. And at times I found it a little bit challenging to match the stencil with the modeling paste already on the background, but for the most part I was able to figure it out and line the two up. And because this took me a little bit of time, and I think you get the idea, I didn't include all of the footage. But after I had put on that second round of modeling paste, this is what the background looked like. And I didn't put it all over because I knew that my photo was going to cover up that area on the left-hand side. So I decided that I would just leave that as is. And then, of course, I had to go back in with some more black splatters. So I really liked the way this looked, but I'm going to change it again. I think that there has to be a balance between a dark background and light modeling paste, and I was just kind of overthinking it maybe, but I do end up liking the final results. So I also didn't plan on covering so much of the background with pattern paper and embellishments, mainly embellishments. So a huge portion of this does get covered up. And I feel a little bit like a broken record. I say that on so many of my mixed media videos that the background gets covered up. But that's why I make a big area of color, because I know that I'm going to put a lot of embellishments and pattern paper over these areas. And I want to make sure that some of the mixed media shows through. And there's actually a decent amount of it showing on this layout. So I decided that I was going to leave the background the way it was and move on to embellishing the layout. So far I have 0 pattern paper on this layout, or embellishments for that matter. And I decided that I wanted to put some big banners that kind of followed that triangular shape in the background. So I cut out a long one to put on the bottom and then a slightly shorter one to stack on top of it. And I used some distress ink to ink the edges of both of those pieces. And then I attach them both down. First, I attach them to each other though, because the ATG adhesive doesn't hold the elements that I put down to the mixed media backgrounds as well as it would if there was no mixed media background. So sometimes these pieces can come off of the background. I do have to go back and add some wet glue eventually to make sure that everything stays in place permanently. But I definitely do not like to use wet glue when first attaching things down because I tend to move things around all the time. So attaching the two pieces together increases the probability that they'll stay stuck down to the layout for at least a little while. So I selected a whole bunch of embellishments that I thought that I could use on this layout. There were tons of embellishments in this kit. And I don't end up using all of them, but I end up using many of them. And I wanted to ink the parts that were white and make them a little bit more antique-y looking. So I used Distress Oxide in Antique Linen. And I think that that's a great way to kind of dull down the white when you want to do that on your embellishments. So I did leave the border on some of them, and then the background is off-white on many of them, and so I just use that antique linen, and I just love the way that that looks. Everything looks more cohesive and a little bit more, not grungy, but a little bit more antique, let's say, with the antique linen. And then I go back and I ink the edges of all the pieces with some Distress ink in black soot, even the ones that I had already added the antique linen ink to. And I like that combination. So as I was inking all of these items, I was thinking that I wanted to use this title, Spooktacular Night, and that I probably wanted to put that up in the upper right-hand corner of my layout. And I didn't know if there were any other orange items that I would put in that corner. And I also like the combination of the black and off-white and the orange. So I used another piece of pattern paper from the kit. It's a nice bright orange stripe, diagonal stripe, and I made a very thin mat to go around the outside of that title. And I was really happy to be able to use that title, Spooktacular Night, because I scrapbook a lot of layouts that have to do with Halloween, because my family goes to Salem, Massachusetts. Sorry if you've heard this in the past, but we've been going there for years, and so I scrapbook all of those photos with a Halloween theme, but very rarely is it at night that I've taken those pictures. So I thought this was perfect. Julia was going to a party at night, and it just worked out really well. And I actually love this collection so much. I'm considering buying another one. It's just that, like I said, I scrapbook so many Halloween layouts, and there's just something about this particular collection that I just find really easy to work with. So I haven't done it yet. I have to see if there are any left by the time I am ready to order another one. I just have to kind of think about it a little bit, and if there are any left, I will get myself another one, because I definitely will get use out of it. I've used up a huge percentage of this kit already, and I definitely know that I would use a second one. I especially am using up the embellishments. The embellishments are just really easy to use, and I'm just kind of loading them on the pages. So you could see that that title cluster is starting to take shape now. I have my title with the orange mat, and then I put some foam behind it so it would pop up a little bit. And then I also included a feather. I thought that would be a nice addition underneath the title. And I fussy cut the border off of that, and then I inked the edges. Now, because this is a punched out Thursday to Die For, I wanted to include some punched out items. I don't believe I use any dies on this layout. I just use my punches. So this first punch that I'm using is a Martha Stewart spiderweb border punch. And I wasn't sure exactly how I was going to use it, so I punched out a few lengths of it. And I ended up putting a long strip along the bottom of the layout underneath that first banner. And then I thought I should put another piece right on top of the photo. So I didn't like the way the edges looked on the piece that's on top of the photo, so I just cut into the spider web a little bit so it would look a little jagged and not just like chopped off like in a straight line. I don't know if that really changed it too much, but I kind of like the way that it looked. And then I added some tags right on top of the photo, but then I was thinking now I can't see that spider web, so I decided to tuck them behind the spider web, and I liked the way that that looked. And one of the first things that I put on the layout was that sentiment that says best costume winner. And that's a little bit sarcastic maybe, because when I asked Julia what her costume was when I was getting ready to scrapbook this photo, she said, I don't even know. She's like, I was just some kind of a emo goth girl. So she clearly didn't think it was the best costume in the world. So I thought that would be kind of funny to put on the layout. And then I also found that there was a bat in a circle. I love circle embellishments and I love bats. So I thought that would be a nice addition to the layout. And then the 31st, even though I don't think this was taken on the 31st, it was still a Halloween party. So I put that on top of the photo. And then I also included those two big fern pieces. And I really love those pieces, but I don't end up using that on the layout. And then I also included this moon, and there was a border around it. I cut the border off so the moon looks a little bit less circular than it might have, but I don't think you could tell too much. And I kept putting it on and taking it off the layout, but it does end up staying on there. And sometimes there are embellishments that I know right from the beginning, like this is definitely going on the layout, and there's others that seem to travel around the page and either find a spot or end up being used on a different layout. So I'm adding to the embellishments. I added some tickets right next to the bat. I kind of tucked them underneath the bat. And then I use a banner that says party, and then I put spooky on top, so it's a spooky party. I love banners. I think banners add such a nice touch to layouts, and I love the way there were quite a few of these, or at least 3 of them that were included in the embellishments for this kit. And so I have those 3 tags on top of the photo. I was happy with those, so I attached them down. And I put them at 3 different heights. I always like to vary the height of something like this so they don't all look exactly the same. So the first one is the medium height, the second one is the tallest one, and the third one is the lowest height. And my main goal with putting those tags at different heights was to keep them from looking too repetitive since they're all the exact same size. So the next punch that I used on the layout was this Stampin' Up bat punch. And I really love this punch. I think that the bats that it punches out are really cool. And I bought this at a scrapbooking estate sale that I went to a while back. And there are some punches that are just so ridiculously expensive. I don't know if this was one of them, but I think that it was a pretty reasonable price, but I think that when I saw it online, it was a lot more. Maybe not one of the highest price ones, but I was really happy to find this punch. So I punched out some bats from some black cardstock, and I spend a lot of time trying to figure out where I want to put these bats on the layout. They move around quite a bit. So if you see that they migrate a little bit as the layout goes on, you'll understand that I didn't want to include all of that footage, since that would be a little boring. So I found that I had these sequins. They're 2 different sizes of orange sequins, and they're self-adhesive. I'm not really sure where I got these from. I probably got them from the Creative Reuse Center that I go to, where they have all kinds of little goodies, and I sometimes will buy a bunch of things like this in a bag. I don't even know what's in the bag, but I organize them all by color, and they all end up coming in handy. So I'm spreading those all around the background, all around the embellishments, and a few on the background as well. And at this point, I thought I was pretty much finishing up the layout, but that doesn't end up being the case. But I also found that I had a little teeny tiny white heart, and I decided to just put that on top of that little circular bat. I thought that would be just a kind of cool little addition. It's very, very small. And then I also placed some self-adhesive purple pearls on the ends of those 2 banners that I have made out of pattern paper. And then I continue adding those sequins all around the layout. And I was really happy that the sequins were 2 different sizes. I love using a combination of sizes on the background. 3 would have been even more perfect, but I'm still happy with 2. So I wanted to put 1 bat on the title cluster just to kind of tie everything on the page together. I end up moving that bat around a little bit later on when I go back into my background to change that. And I also love to add jewels between the sections of banners, so I add some little tiny sparkly black jewels to the banner that says party. And then I always have to add some photo corners. It's one of my favorite things to add to layouts. So I use that same orange paper that I used to mat the title, and I punched out 4 photo corners. I inked the edges with the black soot, and then I added some more of those jewels to the 4 corners. And I think that the jewels that I use in the 4 corners, those are slightly larger than the ones that I use on the banner. So then as I was looking at the layout, and it's really not visible on camera because everything just kind of looks more cohesive on camera, but those black bats were just too dark for the rest of the layout. I felt like they just were like little black spots, like there was no variation to the color, and I really don't like the way that looked. So I decided that instead of just using that black cardstock, I was going to use one of the pattern papers. So there was a plaid pattern paper, you could see it to the right of the mat, and I used some of that paper on another layout, and I was thinking that this would be perfect to punch the bats out of. So I didn't even take the bats away. I just layered the pattern paper ones on top of the cardstock ones, and I inked the edges of the pattern paper bats. Even though it's a black paper, I still think that adding a little bit of ink on the edges does a little something to it. So this is when I decided that I just wasn't happy with the background. I wanted it to be darker. I felt like there was too much white, and then there were too many different embellishments, and it just didn't work for me. Even though I loved the way the background looked, I just didn't like the way it looked in combination with what I had put on top of it. So I guess I had a little bit of like a last minute change of heart about a couple of things. So I added a little bit more of that Shimmerz paint, the purple color, on top of the color that I already had there. And then I added some white splatters all around. And you could still see the modeling paste, but it's just not quite as stark white as it was before. So this is just my personal taste. I sometimes wonder if people are thinking, no, don't do that. And you probably are, but I can't help it. When I'm not happy with a layout, I just keep working on it until I like the way it looks. So this made me happy, and there were a couple of spots where I wanted splatters and they just weren't going there. So I just dotted them on, and I'll do that every now and then, even though authentic splatters always look better than ones that are dotted on, but sometimes you just have to do that. So you can't see this in the final picture of this layout. I put a black border all the way around the outside. I love the way that looks in person, but it makes it almost impossible to take a good photo of the layout, especially a mixed media layout, because there's always a little bit of warping to the paper. Not too much on this one, but it just overall makes it really difficult to take a photo that's perfectly square where you could see the black border all the way around. But just so you know, there is a black border on this layout, and I used some ink along the edges just to kind of grunge them up a little bit. And I cut that background, of course, back a little bit to keep it 12 by 12 inches, and you could see just that thin line of black around the outside. So this is where I decided I just was not happy with the way the embellishments looked. So I pulled them off the background, and I decided that I just wasn't feeling those fern leaves, maybe they are, those branches. I just wasn't feeling them on this layout. I decided to remove them. And instead, I incorporate some fussy cut leaves. There's one piece of paper that is just filled with leaves and jack-o'-lanterns. I haven't used the fussy cut jack-o'-lanterns yet, but these leaves have come in really, really handy. I decided to use yellow and purple leaves on this layout, so you can see that I've kind of tucked those into a couple of different places by the title, by the tags at the top of the photo, and then some in this cluster that I'm working on. And then I didn't like the way the banner and the word spooky were only on that bottom strip of paper. I wanted to move them up a little bit so that the word spooky would overlap both pieces so they would look more like a unit. And then I moved the bat by the title to on top of the letter I. I think that that looks a little bit better, and I think you could still read it. Then I arranged the leaves on the top of the photo, and I think I finally got this layout to look the way I wanted it to. So thank you very, very much for watching. I appreciate that you stayed all the way to the end of this very long video. Please don't forget to check out the channels of Kathy and Ronnie Sue. They'll have some Punched Out Thursday to Die For videos on there where you could see how they use their dies and their punches to make a scrapbooking layout. And they have lots of other great videos too while you're checking out their channels. A Punched Out Thursday to Die For is a hop that we have the second Thursday of each month, so I hope you'll join us again next month. Thank you so much for watching, everybody. Take care. Bye-bye.